He had 2 silver coins, 1 bullet left in his gun, and a hunger so deep it felt like a hole carved straight through his soul. The man's name was Nahuel Yazi, and out here in the Chusca Mountains, a name was just another thing the wind tried to steal. He was crouched behind a juniper tree, its bark twisted like an old man's spine, and his knuckles were white around the grip of his revolver. 30 feet away, a mountain lion stared back at him. It had eyes the color of a frozen sky, and it was eating the rabbit Nahuel had caught in his trap. The first real meat he'd seen in 3 days. He could smell the blood on the air, a coppery tang that made his stomach scream. He'd been living on bitter roots and boiled leather, stuff that kept you breathing but didn't remind you that you were alive. He raised the revolver, the iron sight lining up right between those cold, unblinking eyes. 1 bullet, 1 shot. It was the story of his life, wasn't it? 1 chance, 1 mistake, 1 long, lonely path into nowhere. He could pull the trigger, and maybe he'd eat tonight. Or maybe the cat was faster, and it would eat instead. The choice felt heavy, heavier than the gun. Then something strange happened. The mountain lion stopped chewing. It looked at Nowell, really looked at him, and it was like they understood each other. Two predators, both starving, both backed into a corner by the world. The cat flicked its tail once, a silent warning, then turned and vanished back into the trees without a sound. It just disappeared, leaving the half-eaten rabbit behind. Noel lowered the gun, his breath coming out in a shaky plume of white in the cold air. He didn't feel relief. He didn't feel anything. Just the dull, heavy beat of his own heart, another breath he hadn't earned. He took the rabbit, but he didn't feel like a winner. He felt like he'd just been spared by something wilder and more honest than any man he'd ever known. That night, he sat by a fireless pit outside his small, dark cabin, the silence of the mountains pressing in on him. He looked up at the stars, scattered across the black sky like spilled salt. He knew that somewhere out there, people were laughing. They were sleeping in warm beds, their bellies full, their hands held by someone they loved. He had none of that. He had the cold, the silence, and a ghost for a companion. The ghost of the man he used to be. The next morning he made a decision. He took his last 2 silver pesos, tucked them into a worn leather pouch, and saddled his horse. He was riding down from the mountains, heading for Santa Fe. The road was a scar cut through dry rock and empty plains. The wind kicked up dust devils that spun across the land like lost souls looking for a body to haunt. He rode for 3 days straight, fueled by jerky, water, and a single desperate thought. The thought that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be coming back alone. Santa Fe shimmered in the afternoon sun, a city built from adobe mud and broken promises. The streets were chaos. Wagons groaned under heavy loads. Kids screamed and chased each other through the alleys, and the sound of boots on cobblestone was like a frantic drumbeat. But underneath all that noise, Nahul felt something else. It was a familiar feeling. It was the same gnawing hunger he carried inside him. Everyone here was searching for something. A lucky card, a business deal, a way to fix a life that had gone wrong. They were all just as desperate as he was. They just hid it better behind fancy clothes and loud voices. He tied his horse near the main plaza, where a crude wooden platform had been thrown together. Brightly colored scraps of fabric fluttered from a post, trying to make the whole thing look festive, like a party. But the feeling in the air was cold, colder than the mountain wind. A handwritten sign was nailed to the post, the letters stark and black. Bride auction, 3 p.m. town sanctioned. And underneath, in smaller, sharper letters, no refunds, no questions. Nahuel pulled the brim of his hat down low and melted into the crowd of men gathered around the stage. They were a rough bunch, miners with coal dust ground into their skin, ranchers who smelled of sweat and leather, traders with shifty eyes that measured everything and everyone. Some of them were laughing and joking, slapping each other on the back. Others looked just as empty as he felt. He hadn't come here for a wife. He hadn't come here for a bargain. He'd come here to make a final, desperate gamble with 2 silver coins and whatever was left of his soul. A loud, round man in a black coat climbed onto the platform. It was Don Valerio, the mayor, a man who loved the sound of his own voice. "Gentlemen," He boomed, wiping sweat from his brow with a silk handkerchief. Today is a historic day. Some of you will leave here with a woman worth her weight in gold. Others, he paused for effect, will leave with a lesson in managing your expectations. A few men laughed. Nowell just stood there, his hand closed tight around the 2 silver coins in his pocket. They felt small and cold. 2 coins and one last chance. It was all he had. It had to be enough. One by one, the women were brought onto the stage. They were like ghosts, their eyes hollowed out by grief and hardship, widows whose husbands had been killed in the war, orphans whose families had been wiped out by fever. The bidding started fast and furious. 10 pesos for a young woman who couldn't stop crying. 15 for another who stood as still as a statue, her eyes fixed on some distant point nobody else could see. The prices climbed higher and higher, way out of Nahuel's reach. 20 pesos. 25. He just watched, his face a mask. He wasn't judging them. He wasn't pitying them. He was just seeing them. He saw one girl, couldn't have been more than 19, biting her lips so hard it was about to bleed as strangers shouted out numbers for her soul. He saw another woman who kept her eyes squeezed shut the entire time, as if she could make the whole ugly world disappear. His 2 silver coins stayed in his pocket, feeling heavier with every woman sold. The sun started to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The crowd was getting restless, the excitement wearing off. Men started to drift away, heading for the cantinas. Just when it seemed like the whole sordid affair was over, Don Valerio cleared his throat. "We have one final offer," he said, and his voice sounded a little strange, a little hesitant. A hush fell over the remaining men. They leaned in, curious. What could it be? "By her own request," the mayor announced, "she has chosen to remain veiled until after she is purchased." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Men stood on their toes, craning their necks. And then she walked out. She was covered from head to toe in a thick, coarse brown shawl. You couldn't see her face, her hair, her shape. All you could see were her hands clasped in front of her. They were small and pale, and they didn't tremble. She just stood there, a silent, shapeless figure in the fading light. Whispers erupted immediately. "She's hiding something," one man grumbled. "Probably scarred up from the pox," another one spat. "Or maybe she's a witch," a third one muttered, making a sign to ward off evil. The crowd was turning ugly. Don Valerio tried to regain control. "She is of age, and she is healthy," he insisted. "She comes from a good family that has fallen on hard times." He hesitated again, then just blurted it out. "Let's start the bidding at 5 pesos. Silence. You could have heard a pin drop. The men just stared at the veiled woman, their curiosity turning to suspicion, then to scorn. 5 seconds passed. 10. Then someone at the back of the crowd started to laugh, a harsh, ugly sound. 5 pesos for a ghost in a sack," a man shouted. "She ain't even got a face." That broke the dam. The men started turning away, shaking their heads in disgust. No one wanted a mystery. No one wanted to buy something they couldn't see. The price dropped. 4 pesos. 3. Still nothing. She was worthless. Nahuel just stared at her. While the rest of the world looked away, he saw something. He saw that she never bowed her head. She never flinched when they laughed at her. She just stood there, perfectly still, like a stone in the middle of a raging river. He knew that feeling. He knew what it was like to stand still while the world tried to wash you away. And in that moment, he felt a connection to this faceless woman that was deeper than sight. His voice cut through the noise, rough and clear. 2 pesos. Every head in the plaza snapped toward him. Men stared, their mouths hanging open. Don Valerio looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Sir," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief, "did you say 2? Nahuel didn't answer. He just started walking forward, his boots echoing on the stone. He stepped up to the platform and held out his palm, revealing the 2 small, worn silver coins. "It's all I have," he said, his voice low but firm. "But I'll pay it." The silence exploded into open mockery. 2 damn pesos, someone yelled. "Guess the Apache wants himself a ghost wife." Another one jeered. "He's gone mad from living in the mountains." Don Valerio looked around, hoping for another offer, any other offer. But there was nothing, just laughter and contempt. Finally, with a sigh of disgust, he slammed his gavel down. Sold for 2 pesos to the Apache. Noel didn't even look at him. He just reached out his hand to the veiled woman. She stepped down from the platform, silent, and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. He led her through the jeering crowd to his horse. She climbed up behind him without a word, her arms wrapping gently, hesitantly, around his waist. As they rode out of Santa Fe and into the falling dusk, the laughter of the town faded behind them, until it was nothing but the sound of the wind. That night they made camp in the foothills. Nahuel built a small, clean fire, the flames pushing back the immense darkness of the high desert. She still hadn't spoken. She still hadn't removed the veil. She just sat on the other side of the fire, a silent, shrouded figure. He didn't push her. He didn't ask her name or demand to see her face. He just handed her a piece of cooked rabbit and a cup of water. After a long, quiet time, he finally spoke, his voice soft. You can keep your silence, he said, staring into the flames. I won't take it from you. I just ask for one thing. He looked at her then, his eyes serious. Truth, when you're ready to give it. And for the first time since he'd bought her, he saw her body relax, just a little. Behind the thick brown veil, she took a deep breath, and she didn't flinch. The cabin smelled of old cedar smoke and cold earth. Nahuel pushed the door open, the leather hinges groaning like a man in pain. It was a sound he was used to, the sound of loneliness. He stepped aside, a silent invitation for her to enter first. She hesitated for a beat, her head still bowed beneath that heavy brown shawl. It was clear she didn't know what to expect. Was this a cage? Was he a monster? The air inside was colder than the wind outside. He hadn't lit the hearth in days. It's not much, he said, his voice rough, but it's dry, and it's safe. She finally stepped across the threshold, her movements stiff and careful, like a deer venturing into a hunter's trap. The place was bare. A dirt floor swept clean, a small wooden table pushed under a single grimy window, and a cot in the corner. There were no comforts here, just the bare bones of survival. This was the home of a man who had forgotten how to live. He set a small bag of supplies on the table and knelt to light the fire. The kindling was damp, and it took a few tries, but soon small flames licked at the stones of the hearth, painting the dark room in flickering shades of orange. She stood near the door, keeping her distance, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Are you hungry? He asked, trying to sound casual, trying to make this feel normal when everything about it was strange and broken. She gave a single, small nod. He pulled out a strip of jerky, held it out to her, and then immediately stepped back, giving her space. He didn't want her to feel cornered. She took it from him, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hands didn't tremble, and he realized it wasn't because she wasn't afraid. Her fear was older, deeper. It was the kind of fear that had settled into her bones and made a home there. They ate in complete silence. The only sounds were the snap and crackle of the fire and the lonely howl of the wind outside. Nahuel chewed his jerky slowly, his eyes carefully averted. He didn't want to stare, but he could feel her presence in the room like a physical heat. He broke the silence first. You don't have to tell me anything, he said, his voice quiet. Not tonight. Not ever if you don't want to. He saw her shoulders drop just an inch, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. It was a small thing, but it was a start. Night fell hard and fast in the mountains. The stars outside looked cold and sharp enough to cut you. Nahuel took his own spare blanket and laid it out on the floor beside the hearth. You can take the cot, he said, his back already to her. I'll stay by the fire. She didn't argue. She didn't thank him. She just moved toward the cot, a silent shadow still wrapped in her secrets. Just before he settled down to sleep, he said one last thing, his voice gentle. You don't owe me anything. I know how the world works. I've seen it up close. But this, he paused, this ain't that. Then he laid his head down, turned his back to her completely, and didn't say another word. He was offering her a gift more valuable than 20 pesos, more valuable than gold. He was offering her his trust, no questions asked. When Nahuel woke up, the first thing he noticed was the smell. Coffee. faint but definitely there. He opened his eyes and saw a small pot sitting on the hot coals of the hearth. She was crouched beside it, still veiled, still silent, but she was moving with a quiet purpose that hadn't been there before. He sat up slowly, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. "That yours or mine?" he asked, his voice gravelly with sleep. She paused in her stirring. "My mother used to make it," she said. Her voice was a surprise. It was low and quiet, barely a whisper above the crackle of the fire. But it was steady. It wasn't the voice of a broken thing. "Even when there wasn't anything else to eat," she added softly. It was the first time she had spoken to him, really spoken, and she was sharing a memory, a tiny piece of who she was. Nahuel stood up and walked to the table. She poured 2 cups, her movements graceful, and sat across from him. Still veiled, still a mystery. They drank the weak coffee in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the tense, heavy silence of the night before. This was something different. It was a space they were sharing, not just enduring. When the mugs were empty, he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "I don't need to see your face," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Not until you want me to." He saw her hands, which had been clenched tightly in her lap, slowly unclench. She set her mug down on the table with a soft click. "You'll change your mind," she whispered, her voice full of a bitter certainty. He just shook his head, a small, firm motion. "No," he said. "I won't." A long minute passed. The fire popped. The wind moaned outside the cabin. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, her hands went to the edge of her shawl. She didn't rip it off. She eased it back little by little. First he saw her chin, then her mouth, then her nose. And then she pulled the heavy fabric over her head and it fell away. Her hair was a river of black, thick and wavy, cascading down her back. Her skin was the color of warm clay, and her eyes. Her eyes were the color of river stones after a storm. They were wide and intelligent, and full of a caution that broke his heart. But it wasn't her beauty that made him catch his breath. It was her expression. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pride. It was a raw, stubborn dignity. The kind of dignity that refuses to be extinguished, no matter how hard the world tries to stamp it out. He didn't smile. He didn't gasp. He didn't do any of the things she was probably expecting. He just held her gaze and gave a single, respectful nod. "Thank you," he said softly. She studied his face, her own expression unreadable. "You're not surprised," she stated, her voice flat. "I've seen beauty look like pain before," he answered honestly. The air between them softened. She sat a little straighter, though her hands were still clenched in her lap. "My name is Ayana Monontoya," she said, her voice stronger now. "My father sold me to pay a gambling debt." Her eyes flickered toward the fire. "They made me wear the shawl. They said my face would lower the price." Nahuel's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. But he didn't say a word. He let her speak. "They said no one would want a Pueblo girl with mixed blood," she continued, the words coming out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them in for years. "Especially not one who used to have everything." Used to. That one phrase hung in the air, heavy with loss. "My family," she explained. "We were respected once. We had Spanish blood. We were landowners. Then the war came and took the men. The drought came and took the land. My father, he lost the rest at a card table." She looked away from him, her gaze lost in the flickering flames. "I was his last bet," she whispered, "and he lost me too." Nahuel took a deep, steadying breath. He changed the subject, giving her a way out of the painful memory. "You ever kill a mountain lion?" he asked. She looked up, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I nearly had to," he went on, his voice quiet. "A few nights ago. I had one bullet left. But the cat, it just walked away. I didn't starve. Not because I was a better fighter, but just because it wasn't my time." He leaned in a little closer, his eyes intense. "I don't think God gives us many second chances, Ayana," he said, "but I think you might be one of mine." She blinked, and for the first time, he saw a crack in her armor. He saw the woman behind the pain, the girl behind the wall. That thought he'd had at the auction came back to him. She never flinched when the world looked away, only when someone saw her. He had just seen her, truly seen her, and it was almost more than she could bear. She turned her head away quickly, but not before he saw her wipe at the corner of her eye. That evening they ate a real meal together. A simple stew, but it was hot, and they shared it. She talked more, telling him small things about her life before. Fragments about her mother, about her fear of never truly belonging anywhere. He just listened. He didn't offer advice or platitudes. He just offered her his presence. Before they went to sleep, she asked him the question that had been hanging in the air between them. Why did you really bid for me? Why those 2 pesos? He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames dancing in his dark eyes. Because no one else did, he finally answered. And I knew if I rode away from that stage, I wouldn't ever sleep right again. She nodded once, a small, accepting gesture. The blanket around her shoulders seemed to sit a little lighter. For the first time, she looked like she might belong in this small, quiet room. And as she watched him, she noticed something she hadn't before. The 2 silver pesos he'd paid for her were still sitting on the mantelpiece above the fire. He hadn't spent them. He'd saved them. But far away in a sprawling estate near Tucson, another man was talking about her. He was dressed in fine black clothes, standing in a room filled with polished wood and expensive wine. He held a telegram in his gloved hand. She was sold, he read aloud to the silent men standing before him. In disguise. The buyer was an Apache heading into the Chusca Mountains. The man's face, which had been handsome, turned cold and hard like carved stone. Then find her, he ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. Bring her back, and bring me the man who dared to take what is mine. The air smelled of rain, clean and sharp, even though the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. A storm had rolled through the valley in the night, washing the world clean. Dew clung to every blade of grass, glittering like tiny diamonds in the morning sun. Nahuel stood barefoot in the doorway of the cabin, the cool earth a comfort against his soles. He was sharpening the blade of his small axe, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a familiar, meditative sound. Inside, he could hear Ayana moving around, the gentle clatter of a pot, the soft, steady rhythm of her footsteps on the dirt floor. It had been 3 weeks since the auction, 3 weeks that had unfolded slowly, like a shy flower. They had been filled with long silences, but now the silences were comfortable. They had shared stories, cautious laughter, and simple meals by the firelight. The invisible walls between them were slowly, carefully being taken down, brick by brick. 2 strangers, thrown together by fate, were learning to trust each other. Nahuel had said very little about his own past. He was a man who lived in his silence, and Ayana, who understood the weight of things left unsaid, had never asked. But she was learning to read him anyway. She saw the truth in the way he would sometimes stare off into the trees for too long, his eyes seeing something far away. She saw it in the neat way he folded his spare blanket every morning, a small act of order in a chaotic world. She saw it in his hands, which were always open when he was near her, never clenched, never demanding. This morning she had hung a string of herbs from a beam in the ceiling, filling the small cabin with the scent of wild mint and sage. She was humming a quiet tune under her breath, a sound that made the little cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The veil she had worn was tucked away in a chest, and it had not been seen since the night she had taken it off. Nahuel finished with his axe and leaned it against the wall just inside the door. Ayana turned from her work, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a smile that still seemed to surprise her a little when it appeared. I'm starting a garden, she announced, wiping her hands on her simple cotton skirt. Over by the fence. The soil is soft after the rain. Need any help? He asked. She shook her head, a playful glint in her eyes. I need the space, but I might borrow your muscles later if I need to move any big rocks. He smiled back. It was a rare thing, his smile, and it changed his whole face, softening the hard lines around his eyes. And that's when the knock came. It wasn't a timid tap. It was a firm, measured rap of a fist on the wooden door. Twice. It was a knock that sounded like it belonged there. It wasn't the knock of a stranger. Nahuel's smile vanished. His shoulders went tense. He moved to the door, his body blocking Ayana from view, and pulled it open. A tall man stood on the threshold. He wore a faded blue Union Army coat and a crooked grin. Two long, dark braids hung over his shoulders, and a rifle was slung casually across his back. "Still bad at saying hello, Yazi," the man said. Noel stared for a long second, his face unreadable. Then a slow, wide grin spread across his face, the one he saved for true friends. "Caleb," he said, his voice rough with surprise and relief. They clasped hands and then embraced, a quick, hard hug between men who had survived something terrible together and didn't need words to explain it. Caleb stepped inside, taking off his wide-brimmed hat as his eyes found Ayana. She was standing by the table, her hands frozen in her work, her expression wary and curious. "Well now," Caleb said, his voice kind, "you must be the girl who put some color back in this old ghost." Ayana's chin lifted a fraction. "I'm the one he paid 2 pesos for," she replied, her tone flat and challenging. Caleb blinked, surprised by her directness, and then he let out a loud, booming laugh. "A smart investment," he declared, his eyes twinkling. "You even got him to clean the place up." A flicker of a smile touched Ayana's lips, and she went back to her herbs. But Nowell knew she was listening to every word. Caleb turned back to Nowell, his expression suddenly serious. "I heard things, Nowell," he said, lowering his voice. "Rumors. About a woman bought in a sackcloth. About an Apache bidder making a scene in Santa Fe." He paused. "And I heard about trouble stirring down in Tucson." Nahuel's jaw tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "Don Ricardo Montoya is back," Caleb said, his voice grim. "He came into some money, big money, and he's making a lot of noise about the beloved daughter he lost." Ayana's hands froze. The bundle of herbs she was tying slipped from her fingers and fell to the table. Noel moved to stand beside her, a silent, solid presence. "I didn't take her," Noel said, his voice low and dangerous. "Doesn't matter," Caleb replied, shaking his head. "Men like that don't care about the facts. They care about what's theirs. They care about control." Ayana finally spoke, her voice quiet but shaking with a cold fury. "He gave me away," she said. "He sold me, like livestock." "I believe you," Caleb said gently, his eyes full of sympathy. "But he's still your father, and now he's got money, lawyers, and men with rifles who get paid to not ask questions. He's got friends in Santa Fe who owe him favors." Noel crossed his arms over his chest, his stance unmovable. "Let them come." "No," Ayana said, and her voice was suddenly firm, clear as a bell. "I won't be dragged back there. I won't be his broken little bird in a golden cage ever again." "You won't be," Nahuel promised, his eyes fixed on her. "Not unless you want to go." Caleb sighed and pulled a silver flask from his coat. "Well then," he said, taking a long swallow, "I guess I'll stay for a while. Help out. These hills don't feel as safe as they used to." That night, the mood in the cabin was tense. They ate a quiet dinner of stewed beans and wild onions. Caleb tried to lighten the mood, telling stories about his time as a scout, about skirmishes with bandits, and a night he spent trapped up a tree by a wounded bear. Ayana even laughed once, a real, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise her as much as it did the men. Later, after Caleb had fallen asleep by the hearth, Nahuel was outside splitting firewood by moonlight. Ayana came out onto the small porch, wrapping a blanket tightly around her shoulders against the night chill. "I think I forgot how to breathe for a minute," she said, her voice soft, when Caleb said my father's name. "You're still breathing," he replied, not stopping his work. She leaned against the rough wooden post. "Do you think a person can lose their name? Their whole self?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Everything I was before, it's gone. The house, the family name, my place in the world. It was all a lie anyway." "You're still here," he said simply. "But who am I now?" He stopped chopping and finally looked at her, the moonlight catching the silver in his dark hair. He was quiet for a long moment. "A person's kindness," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "No one can buy it, no one can sell it, but they remember it forever." He looked her straight in the eye. "That's who you are," he said softly. "You didn't disappear, Ayana. Through all of it, you stayed kind. That means you're still you." She blinked hard, turning her face away so he wouldn't see the tears welling in her eyes. Behind them, inside the cabin, Caleb stirred in his sleep. He mumbled something in Navajo, the words garbled but urgent. Shadia, wid, he whispered. Smoke on the wind. Noel's head snapped up. His calm demeanor vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused alertness of a hunter. He sniffed the air. It wasn't the smell of firewood. It was something else. Horses and tobacco. Not close, but close enough. Close enough to be watching. He grabbed Ayana's arm gently and pushed her back inside the cabin. He stepped off the porch, his rifle now in his hand, and melted into the darkness. There was no moon, no movement in the trees, but he could feel them. He could feel their eyes on his home. They weren't alone anymore. The wolves were circling. The next morning, before the sun had even touched the highest peaks, Nahuel and Caleb were gone. They moved like shadows down the side of the mountain, one on horseback, one on foot, blending into the rocks and trees. Near the creek at the bottom of the valley, they found what they were looking for. Boot prints, fresh ones, at least 4 different men, wearing heavy military-issue boots, and the tracks of shod horses. These weren't lost travelers. This was a scouting party. When they got back to the cabin, Ayana was waiting. She had a small satchel packed and sitting by the door. I'm not running, she said, before either of them could speak. Her voice was steady, her chin was high. No one asked you to, Nahuel replied, his eyes scanning her face. She looked at both of them, 2 grim-faced men ready for a fight. But I am not going to sit here and wait for him to decide who I am. Not again. So what do you want to do? Caleb asked, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Ayana took a deep breath. I want to go to him, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. I want to look him in the eye, and I want to say all the things I was too scared to say before. Caleb looked at Nahuel, and a slow, grim smile spread across his face. Then we ride at first light. Far away in a sun-drenched courtyard filled with the scent of roses, Don Ricardo Montoya stood over a polished wooden table, sipping his morning coffee from a delicate china cup. A man in black gloves, the same one from before, approached him and bowed his head. They've been seen, sir, he whispered, north of Shiprock. She's traveling with 2 men. Apaches. Don Ricardo didn't look surprised. He just smiled, a thin, cold smile that held no warmth at all. Excellent, he murmured, taking another sip of his coffee. Then they're riding straight towards me. How convenient. The air was cold and damp as they rode out of the valley, the mist clinging to the river banks like a shroud. Iana sat behind Nahuel, her arms around his waist, but her grip wasn't the fearful, uncertain hold of the woman he'd brought from Santa Fe. This time her grip was firm, resolved. Caleb rode beside them, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, his silence a comfortable, watchful presence. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The time for words was over. This was the time for action. They reached the outskirts of Santa Fe by midday. The city felt different to Ayana now. It didn't feel intimidating. It just felt false. The arrogance, the polished boots, the wealthy families hiding their secrets behind high adobe walls. It all seemed like a stage play, and she was no longer one of the actors. She pulled the brim of her hat lower, ignoring the whispers of a group of women as they passed. Her dress was plain, earth-tone cotton, but she walked with a purpose that made her stand out more than any silk gown could. She didn't hesitate as she walked with Nahuel and Caleb through the gates of the courthouse. There he was, standing at the top of the stone steps, as if he'd been waiting for them. Her father, Don Ricardo Montoya. He was dressed in a fine black coat, his silver cufflinks glinting in the sun. He looked her up and down, his eyes cold and assessing, like she was a horse he was thinking of buying. So, he said, his voice smooth and cool, you've decided to stop hiding in the dirt with the savages. I was never hiding, she replied, her voice clear and steady. You just stopped looking for me. He gave a small, condescending smirk. Let's not play the little rebel, Ayana. You're here. That's all that matters. I've been a forgiving man. I'm here to speak for myself, she said, folding her arms across her chest. Not to be spoken for. His smile faltered. He gestured to the circle of well-dressed men, lawyers, and city officials, standing behind him like vultures. "You'll only embarrass yourself in front of these important men," he hissed, lowering his voice. "I have already arranged a respectable match for you. Marshall Grant is a wealthy man. He is waiting. He has offered our family name a second chance." "That name doesn't belong to me anymore," she said, the words like stones. He stiffened, his face darkening. "You disgrace your bloodline." She took a step forward, her voice rising, sharp enough to cut glass. "You mean your bloodline? The one that sold me in a cloth sack because my mother's skin wasn't white enough for your business partners?" A shocked murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. Even her father's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Don Ricardo's face was a mask of fury. "You were emotional. You still are." "No," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I'm finally clear." He moved closer, trying to intimidate her. He gestured dismissively toward Nahuel and Caleb. "You think this," he spat, "this life of filth and poverty is better than what I can offer you?" Noel's eyes narrowed, but he stayed silent. This was her fight. Ayana didn't even look at her father. She looked past him, at the open sky. "You can't rescue someone who isn't drowning," she said softly. For the first time, his composure cracked. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I came here because I refuse to be hunted like an animal," she said, her voice ringing across the plaza. "I came to tell you that I don't belong to you. Not your money, not your name, and not your shame." One of the officials cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Montoya, this is a matter of legal guardianship." "I am not Miss Montoya," she snapped, cutting him off. "I am Ayana." "That is enough." Don Ricardo's voice was pure ice. "If you walk away now, you choose exile. You choose to be nothing." She looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a slow, sad, steady smile. "No," she said. "I choose myself." He finally turned his venom on Nahuel. "You must be very proud of yourself, Apache. Stealing a man's daughter." Nahuel stepped forward, his presence calm but as solid and unmovable as the mountains themselves. "She's not a possession," he said, his voice low. "And she walked away from you long before I ever met her." "And you think you can give her a better life?" Ricardo scoffed. "I can give her something you never did," Nahuel replied. "Respect." "You will both regret this," Ricardo snarled, his face contorted with hate. He waved a hand and his men parted, letting them pass. It was a small victory, but it felt like an earthquake. As they turned to leave, one of the older lawyers, a man with kind eyes, stepped forward and spoke to Ayana in a low voice. "Your father's influence isn't what it used to be," he whispered, "but be careful. Pride makes powerful men do reckless things." She nodded. "So does fear." That night, they rented a small room above a blacksmith shop. The sounds of the hammer on the anvil rang late into the night. Ayana couldn't sleep. She sat by the open window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the gas lamps flicker on the street below. "You did something brave today," Nahuel said from the shadows behind her. "I just said the things I should have said a long time ago." "It still counts," he said. She looked back at him. "When I was standing there in front of him, I thought I would feel small, afraid, but I didn't." "You shouldn't. You burned every bridge you had left." "Maybe," he said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. "Or maybe you just finally started walking on your own road." She studied his face in the dim light. "Do you ever think about where your name comes from?" she asked. "All the time," he admitted. "I carry two legacies inside me. One from my mother's people, one from my father's. And each one wants me to forget the other." She nodded slowly. "Now I know how that feels." "You are not the thing he tried to make you forget," he said, his voice soft but firm. Her own voice cracked just a little. "Then what am I?" He looked at her, his eyes steady and deep. "You're a woman who walked straight into the lion's mouth," he said, and walked out standing tall. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, in a long, long time, she actually believed it. 2 towns away, in a moonlit hacienda, Don Ricardo stood before a fireplace, staring into the flames. On a table beside him were sealed letters, documents, contracts. One of them bore the official seal of Marshall Grant. His advisor approached him cautiously. "Sir," he said, We have confirmation. They are heading back toward the mountains. Good, Ricardo murmured, his voice a low growl. Let them. Let them think they're safe. He picked up the letter from Marshal Grant, the promise of a powerful alliance, a new beginning for his family name. He didn't open it. He simply held it to the fire and watched it burn. He watched the wax seal melt and drip like a single black tear. He watched the paper curl and turn to ash. He was done with alliances. He was done with appearances. This was no longer about his name. This was about revenge. They reached the edge of their valley just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red. Noel rode in front, his eyes scanning the familiar ridge lines, watching the way the crows circled like dark omens in the sky. Ayana rode behind him, her face chapped by the wind, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Caleb rode off to the side, a silent guardian angel coated in trail dust. They had barely spoken since leaving Santa Fe. There was a new weight in the air between them, the weight of a battle won, and the knowledge of a war yet to come. The cabin came into view, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Moa was there. Ayana's childhood friend was waiting for them, sitting by the fire pit, grinding herbs in a stone bowl. She was a woman of the valley, her face weathered and kind, her hands strong and capable. She stood as they approached, wiping her palms on her skirt. You made it back, she said, her voice a soft comfort. Ayana slid off the horse and fell into her friend's embrace. Moa held her tight for a long moment. You smell like answers, she whispered with a small grin. Ayana managed a short, tired laugh. Then you know it wasn't an easy smell to get. That night, the four of them sat around the fire, the silence of the mountains pressing in around them. It was a heavy, watchful silence. Ayana barely touched her food. He won't take this loss well, Caleb said, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Men like him, men with that much pride, they don't like being publicly embarrassed. I didn't embarrass him, Ayana replied, her voice low. I exposed him. Noel watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the tension in her jaw, the way her shoulders were still braced for a blow. You don't have to carry this by yourself, he said quietly. I do, she whispered, her eyes filling with a fierce, lonely light. Because he made sure there was no one else left to carry it with me. Moa reached into the leather bag she always carried and pulled out a small, tarnished silver mirror. She polished it on her sleeve and handed it to Ayana. You are not the girl who left this valley, she said. Look. Ayana took the mirror. In the flickering firelight, she stared at her own reflection. The girl she used to be, soft, uncertain, desperate to please, was gone. The woman staring back at her had sharper eyes, a harder mouth. She looked older. She looked like a survivor. I used to think shame was like dirt, Ayana said, her voice hollow, her eyes still locked on her own reflection. Something you could just wash off with enough water and soap. She shook her head. But it doesn't come off. It stains you. Moa leaned in, her voice gentle but firm. Then maybe you don't wash it off, she said. Maybe you burn it off. The words hit Ayana like a physical blow. They settled deep inside her, planting a seed. Later that night, long after the others were asleep, Ayana was still awake. She sat by the dying embers of the hearth, a worn, leather-bound book in her lap. It was her mother's prayer journal, one of the only things she had managed to save from her old life before her father sold it all away. She opened it, the pages whispering as she turned them. They were filled with her mother's perfect, elegant handwriting. Pressed flowers fell from between the pages. Their colors faded to ghosts. She found the passage she knew by heart, the words her mother had written shortly before she died. Honor is not given by blood. It is earned by how we live when no one is watching. She closed the book with a soft snap. She stood up and walked to the door. The night was cold and brilliant, the stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Ayana walked barefoot to the woodpile. She took a torch from the hook by the door, lit it from the embers in the hearth, and carried the flame outside. She held the torch to the corner of her mother's journal. The dry leather caught instantly. The flames grew, swallowing the pages, turning her mother's words, her grief, her hopes, into smoke and ash. Noel came out of the cabin, drawn by the light and the smell of burning leather. He saw her standing there, barefoot in her nightdress, her face illuminated by the fire, her expression serene. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. She didn't turn to look at him. "I'm letting go," she said. The flames hissed and popped, as if the book itself was fighting back. "Everything in here," she said, her voice cracking but steady. "It told me how to live to make him proud, what to wear, how to speak, who I was allowed to become." She finally turned to face him, and he could see the glint of tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of release. Not one word in all those pages taught me how to survive when his love was gone. This time, I will not let his shame wear my face. He stepped closer, his presence a comfort in the darkness. "You are not what he said you were." "I know," she said, now. When the journal was nothing but a pile of glowing ashes, she turned and walked back into the cabin. She lay down by the hearth, and for the first time in weeks, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, Nahuel and Caleb found the tracks by the creek. 4 horses, heavy men. They weren't trying to be quiet. They followed the tracks to the narrow pass at the edge of the canyon. Nailed to a dead tree was a piece of paper, the ink still fresh. Nahuel ripped it down and read it aloud, his voice flat. "To the man who stole what is mine, return her, or I will come for her, with fire and with law. R.M." Caleb spat on the ground. "He's bluffing. He wouldn't dare bring the law onto Apache land." "He won't come with the law," Nahuel said, crumbling the note in his fist. "He'll come with enough men to make the law look like an excuse." Back at the cabin, Ayana took the crumpled note. She didn't read it. She simply walked to the hearth and dropped it into the coals. She watched it burn, her face calm. That night, under a sliver of moon, Nahuel sat across from her by the fire. He opened a small wooden box he'd pulled from his saddlebag. Inside, nestled on a piece of soft deer hide, were 2 silver rings. They were simple, hammered into shape by his own hands. He took one out and held it in his calloused palm, offering it to her. "I don't want to put this on your hand," he said, his voice quiet. "Not until you choose to take it." She stared at the ring, her throat tight. "You already paid 2 pesos for me," she whispered. He shook his head. "I didn't buy you, Ayana," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I saw you, that's all." Her fingers brushed against the cool silver of the ring, but she didn't take it. "Not yet." "Then let me earn it," she whispered back. Far below them in the dark canyon basin, Don Ricardo stood over a map, lit by the flickering light of a lantern. A half-dozen hired guns, hard men with dead eyes, stood around him. A crude red X marked the location of Nahuel's cabin. "They think this is over," Ricardo said, his voice soft and amused. "They think they have won." He looked up at the faces of his men. "But Dawn," he said with a cold smile, "Dawn always tells a different story. The smoke was the first warning. It wasn't the thick, lazy smoke of a campfire. It was a thin, sharp ribbon of gray rising from the North Ridge, a place where no one should be. Caleb saw it first. He was crouched on a slope just above the cabin, watching the world wake up. He let out a single low whistle, a signal they had arranged. Down below, Nahuel heard it and lifted his head, his hand instantly going to the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. Ayana was already outside, her back to them, gathering the last of the autumn herbs into a basket. She heard the whistle, too. She didn't freeze. She didn't gasp. She just straightened up slowly, her work forgotten, and turned to face the ridge. "They're here," Caleb said, his voice a low growl as he slid down the hill to join Nahuel. "Scouts?" Nahuel asked. "Too many for scouts," Caleb replied, his eyes narrowed. "I count 5 on the ridge, and there are more behind the tree line, waiting." Ayana walked towards them, a long, dark braid swinging against her back. "How much time do we have?" she asked, her voice calm. Caleb looked at the smoke again, then at the position of the sun. "They'll be here by sunset if they ride slow to spook us. Sooner if they're feeling stupid." Noel didn't waste a second. "Then we get ready now." The day passed in a blur of quiet, purposeful activity. There was no panic, only grim determination. Caleb sat on the porch, meticulously cleaning and checking their rifles, laying out the powder and shot. Noel worked the perimeter of the small homestead, reinforcing the crude fence with sharpened branches and heavy stones. He stretched a thin wire between two pine trees on the path leading up the rear slope, and tied a string of old rusty bells to it. It wasn't much, but it would scream a warning if anyone tried to sneak up on them from behind. Inside the cabin, Ayana worked with a focused intensity. She shuttered the windows and packed sacks with their meager rations: flour, jerky, salt. She filled their water skins, her hands steady. But as she worked, a war was raging inside her. Part of her, the old part, wanted to run, to grab a horse and disappear into the mountains, to hide until the danger passed. But another part of her, a new, stronger part, was so tired of running. She walked into the small sleeping area and opened the cedar trunk at the foot of the cot. Inside, folded neatly, was the thick brown shawl she had worn at the auction, the one that had hidden her from the world. She took it out, held it in her hands for a long moment, then walked to the hearth and placed it under the pile of firewood. A silent offering. Just after noon, Moa arrived. She rode up the path on a sturdy mountain pony, her face serene, but her eyes sharp and watchful. She carried bundles of sage, a small bag of sacred blue cornmeal, and a clay bowl filled with ash from her own family's hearth. "You are not alone in this," she said as she embraced Ayana. "I know," Ayana replied, her voice thick with emotion, "but I think I need to feel alone before I can stop being afraid of it." Moa placed a hand on her friend's cheek. "Then come with me," she said gently. They walked to a small clearing behind the cabin. Moa drew a circle in the earth with a stick. Into the circle she poured the ash, the cornmeal, and the petals of dried wild roses. "You were born between two worlds, Ayana," Moa said, her voice like a chant. "Taught to be small, taught to smile when you wanted to scream. But the fire of your mother's people, the fire that made you, it is still inside you." Yana knelt in the dirt. "What if I'm not enough of either one?" she whispered, the old fear creeping back into her voice. Moa smiled a sad, wise smile. "Then you are already more than both." They lit the bundle of sage and the sweet, cleansing smoke filled the air. Ayana closed her eyes and breathed it in, letting the scent fill her, letting it feel like a memory of strength. And she whispered something to the wind, words meant only for herself. "My name," she said, so quietly it was almost lost, "was never yours to give away." When she stood up, she was taller. Back in the cabin, Nahuel had taken the silver ring from its box and placed it on the table, right in a patch of sunlight. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The afternoon light began to fade, the shadows growing long and sinister. Ayana came out of the cabin. She wore her simplest cotton dress, but she had a knife strapped to her thigh, the one Nahuel had given her. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder. He came to stand beside her, his rifle in his hand. "Are you ready?" he asked. She didn't look at him. She just stared out at the silent, watching trees. "I don't think I'll ever be ready for this," she said honestly. He nodded. "Then just be brave." She finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what kind of woman I might have been if none of this had ever happened?" "No," he said without a moment's hesitation, "because that woman would have never found her way to me." Her lips parted to speak, but the words were stolen from her by a new sound. The distant, unmistakable thunder of horses' hooves. They were coming. They didn't charge. They came slowly, deliberately, emerging from the tree line like ghosts at dusk. There were 8 of them, all armed, their faces hard and grim. They fanned out, forming a wide, menacing crescent around the small homestead. Then a final rider appeared. He rode a magnificent black horse, and his coat was so dark it seemed to absorb the fading light. Don Ricardo Montoya. He dismounted with a slow, theatrical grace, pulling off his leather gloves as he walked toward the gate. "Daughter," he called out, his voice echoing in the sudden silence, "it is time for this foolishness to end." "You can say what you have to say from there," Nahuel called back, stepping forward, his rifle held ready. Ricardo ignored him, his eyes fixed on the cabin door. "I have come with an offer of patience," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I have come with forgiveness." "You've come with hired guns," Ayana said, her voice ringing out from the doorway. He finally looked at her, and a cold smile touched his lips. You have forgotten your place in the world. No, she replied, stepping out onto the porch. I have finally remembered it. His smile turned into a venomous sneer. You truly don't understand what you are throwing away, do you? I do, she said, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. I am walking away from a name that was built on secrets and silence. You still carry my blood, he roared, his mask of civility finally slipping. I carry what you gave me, she said, taking another step forward into the yard. But I no longer carry what you tried to take from me. One of the men behind Ricardo shifted, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. From the shadows on the porch, Caleb's rifle raised an inch in response. The air grew thick, electric with unspoken violence. This land isn't your, Nahuel said, his voice a low, steady warning. And neither is she. Ricardo's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Then you will both starve in it. Ayana stepped right up to the crude fence until she was only a few feet away from him. If you set 1 foot past this gate, she said, her eyes blazing, you will find out what I am really made of. And for the first time, Don Ricardo hesitated, because he saw it. He saw it in her eyes, in her stance, in the set of her jaw. She wasn't the frightened girl he had sold. She was not afraid of being disowned by him. She had already disowned him. That night, the campfires of Ricardo's men burned like angry eyes in the valley below. They hadn't attacked. They were waiting, coiling like a snake before it strikes. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. No one slept. Ayana sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of water, staring into the flames. The silver ring Nahuel had made still sat on the table, gleaming in the firelight. He came and sat beside her, not speaking, just sharing the silence. After a long time, she reached out, her hand steady, and picked up the ring. She slowly, deliberately slipped it onto her own finger. There was no ceremony. There were no promises spoken aloud. There was only a choice, made freely, and finally. At the first hint of dawn, the silence broke. It wasn't gunfire. It was the slow, rhythmic beat of a single horse approaching, steady and certain. The sound of an executioner on his way to work. Nahuel was already at the door, rifle in hand. Caleb was a dark shape on the roof of the cabin, his own rifle resting on the peak. Moa stood by the horses, a bow in her hand, an arrow already knocked on the string. Ayana stepped out into the cold morning air just as he appeared. Don Ricardo rode alone this time. No more hired guns. He was dressed in a formal black coat, a saber at his hip. He looked like he was attending a funeral. He halted his horse in the open space and dismounted, his eyes taking in the small, defiant homestead. Then his gaze landed on Ayana, and it held. You have made your point, he said, his voice flat. Then why are you still here? She asked. A strange, sad smile touched his lips. Because I believe in giving people one last chance to come to their senses. From the roof, Caleb muttered, Funny how a man holding a sword always thinks he's the one offering mercy. Ricardo raised his voice, so all could hear. You have until sundown. After that, I will come through that gate, and I will not be asking permission. If you step through that gate, Nahuel said, his voice like flint, you won't be walking back out. Ricardo ignored him, his eyes locked on Ayana. This is your last chance. No, she said, her voice ringing with a power that surprised even herself. This is yours. The day you sold me was the last day I was your daughter. The wind picked up, swirling dust between them like a ghostly barrier. Without another word, Ricardo turned, mounted his horse, and rode back to his men. He didn't look back. The day passed in a state of suspended animation. They worked, they waited, they watched. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and fire. The wind grew colder. They heard the horses first. Ricardo's men were moving, forming a wide semicircle around the cabin. But they didn't attack. From the center of the line, Ricardo raised a white cloth, a parley. Nahuel stepped forward, his rifle lowered but not set aside. Ricardo approached alone, stopping 10 paces from the gate. I came with only words this time, he said. and a name. Ayana walked out from the cabin to stand beside Nahuel. Her hair was unbound, flowing freely down her back. She wore a woven sash across her chest, a sash of brown and crimson, the colors of earth and fire, the colors of both her bloodlines. "Speak it then," she said. He took a deep breath. "Your name is Esperanza Monontoya. It means hope. You were born to rise above all this." She just shook her head slowly. "My name is Ayana, and I wasn't born to rise. I was born to survive." He tried to soften his voice, to play the part of the caring father one last time. "This world does not respect survival, child. It respects power." "That's why this world is broken," she replied. He held out a piece of paper, an official document, stamped and sealed. A marriage license. "Marshall Grant is still willing." Before he could finish, Ayana took 2 steps forward. She drew the small knife from her belt, and with a single, swift motion, she sliced the document in half. She let the 2 pieces flutter from her fingers. The wind caught them and carried them away. Don Ricardo's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "You think this ends with theatrics? You think these people can protect you?" "They don't have to," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I already did that for myself." He reached for the saber at his hip, and in that instant, everything changed. A sharp whistle cut through the air from the trees behind Ricardo's men. It was Caleb. A warning, but not for them. Ricardo's men began to look around, confused. Nahuel raised his rifle. Moa drew back her bowstring. Ricardo's hand froze on the hilt of his saber. He saw something in Ayana's face he had never seen before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't defiance. It was pity. "Don't," she said softly, "because if you try to make me yours again, I will show you and all of Santa Fe exactly what you created." A long, tense second stretched into an eternity. And then, another sound. The sound of more horses, dozens of them, pouring out of the trees behind Ricardo's men. They were warriors from Moa's village, and men from the surrounding homesteads, men Nahuel had traded with, men who respected him. They were carrying rifles, bows, axes. They were silent, and they were surrounding Ricardo's hired guns. Caleb hadn't just been watching the ridge. He'd been sending signals. Slowly, Ricardo's hand dropped away from his weapon. He looked at the silent army that had appeared from nowhere. He looked at the unshakable man his daughter stood beside. He looked at his daughter, and he finally understood. He hadn't just lost a fight. He had lost the whole war. Without another word, he turned, stumbled to his horse, and rode away. His men, seeing they were hopelessly outnumbered and their employer had fled, threw down their weapons and followed. This time, he was gone for good. That night, the 4 of them sat in the quiet stillness, under a canopy of stars. No one spoke. There was no need. Ayana twisted the simple silver ring on her finger. It wasn't a symbol of ownership. It was a symbol of choice. Nahuel handed her a cup of warm cider. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Not with the same weapons," Nahuel said. Caleb, cleaning his rifle by the fire, added, "Men like that don't die easy, but their pride does, and has just broke into 1,000 pieces." Ayana looked at the dying fire, at the ashes of her mother's journal, at the memory of the burning threat from her father. "Then let his name turn to dust," she whispered, "and blow away on the wind." The frost came early that year, dusting the high peaks with a layer of white and sending a sharp chill down into the valley. Winter was coming, not with a roar, but with a quiet, steady inevitability. Ayana woke to the soft sound of Nahuel chopping wood outside, the clean, rhythmic thud of the axe, a comforting start to the day. Caleb had ridden north a few days before, promising to be back before the first heavy snow. Moa was back in her village carrying a message from Ayana, a final letter not of hate or forgiveness, but simply of release. The cabin was quiet, but for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. She slipped out of the warm bed, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet. She wrapped herself in a thick wool shawl, one she had woven herself, and stepped out onto the porch. Nahuel looked up and gave her a small smile. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Finally," she said. He handed her a steaming mug of pine needle tea. They stood together in the soft morning light, not speaking, just watching the smoke from the chimney rise up to meet the pale blue sky. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a comfort to be shared. "Do you know what I remember most about that first day I came here?" she asked after a while. He turned to her, his dark eyes questioning. "You didn't look at me like I was broken," she said softly. "You didn't treat me like something to be pitied." "You weren't," he said simply. "But I didn't believe that," she admitted. "Not yet." He studied her face, the new strength in her eyes, the quiet confidence in the set of her mouth. "Do you believe it now?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I do." Later that day, they walked down to the river. The water was running low and clear over the smooth stones. Ayana carried a small cloth bundle. Inside were the last remnants of her old life, the ashes of her mother's journal, a ribbon she had worn in her hair as a girl, the last tattered piece of her father's name. She knelt by the water's edge and unwrapped the bundle, letting the contents scatter into the current. The wind and the water took them, pulling them away, downstream until they were gone. Nowell stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her back. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just watched until every last piece had disappeared. When it was done, she stood up. "Let the river carry what I no longer need," she said. As they started back toward the cabin, she added, "It's strange. I thought I would feel lighter." "Healing doesn't happen all at once," Nahuel said, his voice thoughtful. "It happens in the quiet moments, when you're not even looking for it." That night, they sat at the small kitchen table, planning their garden for the spring. Carrots here, beans there, squash along the fence line. Ayana drew the design on a piece of parchment, her handwriting strong and sure. Noel talked about adding another room to the cabin, not for anything specific, just for more space, more room to grow. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Ayana reached into a small wooden box on the mantelpiece. It was a box her mother had given her years ago, a box she had kept hidden and unopened through all the turmoil. Inside, nestled on a piece of faded silk, were 3 perfect kernels of corn, smooth and golden as the setting sun. She took one out and placed it in the center of the table. "Planning on planting that?" Nahuel asked with a smile. "Not yet," she said, her own smile answering his. "I just want to remember that it's here." Later, as they lay in the darkness, the sound of the wind, a low lullaby outside, Ayana rested her head on his chest. "I used to think love was a kind of debt," she whispered, "something you had to earn, or something you owed someone." "And now?" he asked, his arm tightening around her. "Now," she said, her voice soft with sleep, "I think it's more like land, something wild that you care for, not something you own. And if you tend to it right, it gives you back everything you need." Outside, the world was turning, slow and unstoppable. The mountains stood silent guard, holding up the star-filled sky. Ayana closed her eyes. She wasn't a name. She wasn't a price. She wasn't what had been taken from her. She was what remained. She was what she had chosen to become. And in the deep, quiet stillness of that mountain night, the truth finally settled over her, soft and gentle as the coming snow. Some stories don't end with a grand rescue or a fiery revenge. Some stories end quietly. They end with a woman who is no longer asking for her freedom, because she is already living it. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of survival, justice, and the wild human heart, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below. What do you think is stronger, blood or choice? Until next time, stay safe out there.